Yes, Burkina Faso is set to start transforming its cotton into fabrics. This is a new plan that has been inaugurated today by Ibrahim Traoré. The capacity.
Something strange just happened in Africa. No one heard an explosion, but the world still shook. In the heart of Burkina Faso, deep beneath the Sahel sun, a machine began humming, softly at first, then louder, until it drowned out decades of silence. No speeches, no warnings, just the roar of engines weaving cotton into destiny. And that's when the world realized Africa isn't asking anymore. It's a building. Because Ibrahim Traoré didn't just open a factory, he cracked open a system. And from the dust of history rose something the West swore would never happen, an African nation manufacturing its own future. This isn't just cotton. This is payback stitched into fabric. Let's talk about it in detail, because you are not ready for how it was made possible. In a city called Ouagadougou, where dust meets determination, something extraordinary had begun. At first, it seemed ordinary enough. Another factory, another ribbon, another speech. But then, the lights flickered on. Rows of looms came alive. Cotton began to move. And that's when it hit. This wasn't an opening ceremony. It was a statement. Because on that day, Burkina Faso officially launched a cotton factory that could produce 20,000 tons of fabric every single year, creating 5,000 direct jobs, a scale no one thought possible for a nation long written off as agricultural. But here's where the story turns. This wasn't funded by Western donors. No international aid, no glossy partnerships. This was built by Burkina Faso. And that's what makes this so unsettling for some. For decades, the script was clear. Africa grows, the world profits. Raw cotton leaves African soil, sails across oceans, gets spun, dyed, branded, and sold back at 10 times the price. It's an old game, played in quiet boardrooms and old colonial ports. But that day in Ouagadougou, Captain Ibrahim Traoré did something almost unthinkable. He interrupted the system. He didn't give a speech about empowerment. He didn't beg for development grants. He built a factory and rewrote the rules of the economy in real time. The hum of those machines was the sound of Africa keeping what it grows. Let's put this into perspective. Burkina Faso is landlocked, resource-constrained, and constantly underestimated. It has no seaport, limited infrastructure, and a fraction of the capital that global textile giants control. By every Western metric, this factory shouldn't exist. But here it stands, a modern, high-capacity industrial complex spinning cotton into finished fabric under Burkina Faso management. A nation that used to export raw fiber now exports finished goods. And that, economically speaking, changes everything. So, why does this matter? Because industrialization isn't just about production, it's about possession. Who owns the process? Owns the profit. And who owns the profit controls the narrative. That's why this hum in Ouagadougou echoes louder than any speech. It's a quiet declaration of independence, not from flags or foreign armies, but from economic dependency itself. Every meter of fabric that rolls off those looms is more than material. It's proof. Proof that a nation can rise without permission. Proof that Africa's future doesn't need approval to begin. And yet, the real story isn't just that Burkina Faso built this factory. It's how it did. Because behind every gear, every worker, every ton of fabric, there's a plan so deliberate, so precise, it forces you to ask, how did a small, landlocked nation outsmart a global system designed to keep it dependent? To understand how Burkina Faso pulled this off, you have to step back and see the chessboard the way Captain Ibrahim Traoré sees it. Because this wasn't luck. It wasn't a miracle. It was a strategy, calculated, patient, and quietly revolutionary. For decades, Africa's development narrative has been written in borrowed ink. Plans drafted in Washington, funding tied to conditions, and progress measured by someone else's spreadsheet. Burkina Faso was supposed to follow that script. Export the cotton, import the profit. But Traoré? He tore up the manual. He started with a simple but radical question. Why are we rich in raw materials but poor in everything else? That single question became a roadmap, not a speech, a system. The answer began with control over production. When Burkina Faso reclaimed its mines from foreign operators, many thought it was symbolic. But Traoré wasn't collecting headlines. He was collecting leverage. Gold revenues went back into the state treasury, funding infrastructure, local engineering programs, and, eventually, the very machines that now hum inside the cotton factory. It's a pattern that's starting to define his leadership. Resource becomes revenue, becomes reinvestment, and reinvestment becomes independence. No begging, no bailouts, just a closed circuit of self-reliance. And that's the beauty of it. While the world kept labeling it anti-Western populism, Traoré was quietly building an industrial base. Here's where the story gets interesting. Before construction even began, teams of local engineers were trained abroad, some in China, some in India, others in neighboring Ghana. Not to stay there, but to return. They came home with knowledge, blueprints, and machines, determined to prove that industrial skill isn't imported. It's taught. The design of the factory itself reflects that mindset. Built almost entirely with regional materials, powered partly by local energy grids, and organized under Burkina Faso management. Every piece of it says the same thing. Ownership matters. Because when you own the process, no one can pull the plug on your progress. But there's another layer to this. The West's economic influence thrives on dependence, not disaster. Loans, not gifts. Advisors, not equals. By proving that development can happen without them, Traoré did more than build a factory. He exposed a vulnerability in the global order. He showed that Africa's biggest limitation was never capacity, it was permission. And that's the real revelation here. Industrialization isn't about technology alone, it's about psychology. It's about a leader convincing his people that they can build, own, and run complex systems on their own terms. You can import machines, but believe, you have to forge that locally. And that belief is spreading. Young technicians now speak about manufacturing as if it were national defense. Farmers see cotton not as a crop, but as currency. Economists whisper that Burkina Faso has achieved something most nations only theorize: value retention. No wonder the air around the factory feels charged, half electricity, half symbolism. This isn't just production, it's a rehearsal for sovereignty. But there's still one question lingering in every conversation around Traoré's plan. Even if Burkina Faso can build industries on its own, can it sustain them without the financial backing of the West? Let's pause for a second to say, big thank you to the Black Culture Diary community, where Black voices, stories, and legacies are preserved and amplified. By becoming a member, you're not just supporting the channel, you're becoming part of a powerful cultural movement. Let's continue. Here's the question that had every analyst scratching their heads. If there was no IMF loan, no Western development partner, no billion-dollar investor from abroad, then where on earth did Burkina Faso get the money to build this? Because a plant capable of producing 20,000 tons of fabric a year isn't built on enthusiasm. It's built on capital, logistics, and cold numbers. And yet, somehow, the math worked. The secret lies in a quiet financial reroute that began long before this factory existed. When Traoré nationalized segments of the gold industry, critics called it reckless. But here's what few noticed. He didn't close those mines, he reorganized them. Royalties once wired to offshore accounts started landing in the national treasury. Within months, that revenue became the seed fund for industrial projects, with this cotton factory being the first tangible fruit. In simple terms, Burkina Faso began using its own gold to spin its own cotton. And that, geopolitically speaking, is a quiet revolution. But it didn't stop there. The government launched local bond programs, inviting citizens, small cooperatives, and diaspora investors to buy into the nation's growth. It wasn't charity, it was participation. People who'd never owned stock in anything suddenly owned a stake in a national industry. The factory didn't just create workers, it created shareholders. And when citizens become investors, patriotism stops being abstract. It starts paying interest. This move accomplished something even more profound. It redefined wealth. For the first time, Burkina Faso citizens weren't just earning from labor, they were earning from ownership. That shift, psychologically and economically, is seismic. Also, Traoré quietly forged deals with Mali and Niger, members of the Alliance of Sahel States, to share infrastructure and transport corridors. Instead of competing for the same foreign investors, these nations began pooling resources, moving materials across shared borders without the usual bureaucratic choke points. The result? Lower transport costs, shared energy supply, and a miniature internal market capable of sustaining production without foreign buyers. In other words, the Sahel built its own supply chain, while the world wasn't paying attention. What you're seeing here isn't just financial innovation, it's philosophical realignment. For generations, Africa was taught that development requires outside validation, grants, consultants, and feasibility studies. Traoré's model says the opposite. Money is never the beginning of independence, it's the result of direction. He reversed the order. He started with a purpose, found the revenue internally, and let production justify the spending. That's not anti-Western, it's anti-excuse. And that's why this model terrifies the financial establishment. Because if one landlocked country proves it can self-fund industrialization, what happens when 10 others try? Burkina Faso didn't just build a factory. It built a financing formula. A formula that cuts middlemen, collapses dependency, and gives ownership back to the people whose sweat built the wealth in the first place. And that raises a much bigger question, one that the world can't ignore anymore. If Africa can fund itself, what happens to the nations that made billions keeping it dependent? Here's a reminder to please like and share the video and subscribe to our channel to watch more videos on Black culture, history, civilization, and identity. Let's continue now. In Bamako, engineers began sketching refinery blueprints on napkins. In Niamey, policymakers discussed joint textile ventures using the same Sahel cotton roots. In Accra and Lomé, trade ministers suddenly sounded less like administrators and more like architects. The change wasn't just economic, it was psychological. For decades, African governments were told to focus on exports. Now they were asking, exports of what? Raw hope? Unfinished dreams? Traoré's model exposed a simple but devastating truth. The difference between a developing country and a developed one is who owns the factory. The minute Burkina Faso owned its first, the vocabulary started to crumble. Back inside the factory, something quietly extraordinary was happening. The workforce, once seasonal farmers, was learning industrial skills, machine calibration, quality control, supply logistics. These weren't just jobs, they were transformations. Every worker trained became a node of expertise. And as they shared that knowledge across the region, the Sahel's identity shifted from subsistence zone to production belt. Economists call it skill transfer. But on the ground, it feels like evolution. Men and women who used to depend on rainfall now depend on precision. It's the same soil, the same people, a different destiny. And the markets noticed. European textile traders, long accustomed to cheap African cotton, started facing a problem: the price of dependency had gone up. African mills were no longer exporting raw fiber, they were competing with finished fabric. Burkina Faso even began negotiating export deals within Africa, cutting out the middlemen and undercutting foreign suppliers. For the first time, African trade wasn't vertical, it was circular. The continent was buying from itself. And that simple shift, one intra-African transaction at a time, started doing what decades of trade summits never could: create a genuine internal market. Meanwhile, in Paris, Brussels, and Washington, the memos began to circulate. Reports describing Burkina Faso's unorthodox industrial model. Briefings warning of emerging economic nationalism in West Africa. Translated, that means they're doing it without us. For a century, the West sold Africa the illusion that progress came through partnership. But partnerships that require one side to stay weak aren't partnerships, they're hierarchies. And Traoré's cotton factory just broke the chain. So now, Western institutions face a paradox: support Africa's new independence and lose control, or resist it and lose relevance. Either way, the balance is shifting. If you stand near the factory at dusk, you'll hear it, the machines humming like a chorus of new beginnings. But listen closely, and you'll realize it's not just machinery. It's the sound of an entire continent remembering its potential. The cotton threads aren't the product anymore, they're the signal. A signal that the post-colonial bargain is expiring. A signal that industry, not ideology, will define Africa's next century. And as that hum grows louder, one final question begins to rise from the dust. If a small landlocked nation can ignite a continental transformation with one factory, what happens when Africa builds hundreds? Every revolution begins quietly. Burkina Faso began with cotton. But make no mistake, this isn't just about fabric anymore. It's about control. Control of production, control of wealth, control of destiny. And that, more than anything, explains why the world is suddenly paying attention. Because when you trace the ripple outward, from the Sahel to the Sahara to the coast, you realize this factory was never meant to stay local. It was a signal flare for a continent ready to unlearn dependency. Traoré's industrial plan has quietly turned into a political manifesto. Across Africa, leaders are watching him redefine what sovereignty looks like, not through constitutions or slogans, but through production lines and payrolls. The African Union's trade forums are suddenly echoing his logic. the Pan-African payment system, once a slow bureaucratic idea, is now gathering momentum because of examples like this. If nations can manufacture locally and trade regionally, then the need for foreign currency, foreign aid, and foreign validation all begin to fade. That's the silent revolution no one was ready for. A revolution that trades speeches for factories. And that has forced Western policymakers into an uncomfortable realization. Their greatest competitor in Africa isn't China. It's Africa itself. There's irony here. For years, global institutions urged Africa to invest in value addition. But the moment it did, the tone changed. Now it's called economic nationalism. When the West centralizes its industries, it's called efficiency. When Africa does it, it's called risk. That double standard isn't just unfair, it's unsustainable. And this cotton factory just exposed it to the world. Because if Burkina Faso can process its cotton, mine its gold, refine its oil, and still stand, what happens to the trillion-dollar industries that relied on Africa staying unindustrialized? That's the moral tension no one wants to discuss. Progress for Africa means discomfort for others. And yet, progress is coming anyway. In global markets, analysts are already whispering about a Sahel model, a self-funded industrial ecosystem anchored by local resources and regional collaboration. They laughed at the idea 2 years ago. Now they're studying it. Textile giants are adjusting supply forecasts. Investors are tracking West African commodity indices for the first time in decades. And in boardrooms from Paris to Washington, one uncomfortable truth keeps surfacing. Burkina Faso has proven that independence pays dividends. If one small, landlocked nation can finance and operate its own industry, what stops Nigeria, Kenya, or Ghana, countries with far greater capital, from doing the same? This isn't isolationism. It's self-definition. And the balance of economic gravity is already tilting. In Ouagadougou, as the sun sets behind the factory walls, the machines keep running. The lights stay on, the hum continues. Some call it production, others call it prophecy. Because what Ibrahim Traoré built here isn't just a factory, it's a mirror, reflecting what Africa could be if it ever stopped asking for permission. History will remember this not as an industrial milestone, but as a psychological one. The moment a soldier realized that factories can do what armies can't, defend a nation's dignity. So when you hear that steady hum in Burkina Faso, remember this. It isn't the sound of cotton spinning. It's the sound of an empire's silence breaking. And it's only getting louder. What would it mean if every African nation decided to keep what it grows and process it at home? Let us know in the comments section. How long do you think the world's old economic order could survive if Africa stopped exporting its wealth? Do you want to watch more videos like this one? If so, subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon next to it. We have decided to bring videos on something nobody talks about: the Black culture, civilization, history, and evidence about how glorious Blacks have been. Thanks for watching, and until the next video, stay tuned.